This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. Today, we are digging into a really critical choice facing Nepal's economy. Should it stick with austerity or pivot towards growth? It's a story about a clash between two very different realities.
And this quote right here, it really just nails the problem. There's a huge gap, a dangerous one, between the official story coming from policymakers and what businesses are actually experiencing every single day.
And here's what that disconnect looks like. On one hand, the official narrative is all about stability, discipline, and being prudent. Sounds great, right? But on the other hand, the reality for businesses on the ground is, well, it's brutal. Credit is completely choked off, the economy is stagnating, and orders are just vanishing into thin air.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dive deeper into that disconnect. Then, we'll look at the IMF's advice and why it might be the wrong prescription. After that, we'll see the real-world impact on small businesses, learn some lessons from Nepal's neighbors, and finally, forecast the policy pivot that seems almost inevitable at this point.
All right, first up, understanding this tension is absolutely key. It's the only way to make sense of why policies that sound good are causing so much economic pain and creating such a massive dilemma for the country.
And that leads us straight to the IMF. Now, their advice carries a ton of weight globally. But the big question here is, are they offering the right medicine for what's actually ailing Nepal?
You see, the standard IMF playbook is designed to fight something called demand-pull inflation. Think of an economy that's just overheating. Too much money, too much government spending, easy credit, everyone's buying stuff. The solution? You tighten the money supply to cool things down. Simple enough.
But here's the catch. That's not what's happening in Nepal. The country's actually facing cost-push inflation, and that's a completely different animal. It's not about too much demand, it's about the cost of producing things going through the roof, mostly because of things happening outside the country.
So what's really driving inflation in Nepal? Well, it's not homegrown. It's being imported. We're talking about global fuel prices, supply chain chaos from the pandemic, and really high taxes on imported goods. Trying to fix these problems by squeezing local demand just doesn't work. And this analogy really says it all. The effect of applying these policies is like putting a malnourished patient on a crash diet. It's not just ineffective, it's actively making the patient weaker. It's harmful.
So who's paying the price for this mismatched policy? Well, the answer is painfully clear. It's the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs. And these businesses are the absolute backbone of Nepal's domestic economy.
And just to give you a sense of their importance, SMEs contribute an estimated 22% to the entire country's GDP. They're not just some minor part of the economy, they're a massive, vital engine of production and commerce.
And it's not just about abstract economic numbers. We are talking about 1.7 million jobs. When SMEs struggle, it becomes a real crisis for millions of families across the country. The human stake is enormous.
So how exactly are they being suffocated? It's really a two-pronged assault. First, the government cuts spending, which sucks demand out of the economy. Then, the central bank tightens monetary policy, which makes it nearly impossible for these businesses to get the loans they need just to operate.
And you have to understand, for a small business, a working capital loan isn't a luxury. It's not for some grand expansion. It is the very oxygen they need to survive, to buy raw materials, to pay their staff, to fulfill the orders they do have. And right now, current policy is systematically cutting off that oxygen supply.
This all presents a really tough choice for policymakers. And to understand just how high the stakes are, it's really useful to look at the different paths recently taken by two of Nepal's neighbors, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh.
Now, both of these countries went for a growth-first strategy, but the way they did it made all the difference. Sri Lanka funded its growth with foreign currency debt, which, as we know, led to a catastrophic default and collapse. Bangladesh, on the other hand, funded its growth mostly by borrowing from within its own country in its own currency, which allowed it to keep growing and avoid that same fate.
The lessons for Nepal here are crystal clear. Trying a Sri Lanka-style dash for growth, funded by international borrowing, would be suicidal. But a growth strategy that's focused on stimulating the internal economy, financed by domestic borrowing, well, that could be a viable path forward.
Okay, so you take the disconnect, the mismatched policies, the suffering of the economy's backbone, and it all points in one direction. A major policy pivot isn't just possible, it's pretty much inevitable. So let's look at what that's likely to mean.
So what is the most probable scenario here? Given the immense political and economic pressure that's building,
Just sticking with the status quo seems completely untenable. Something has to give.
Now, this pivot probably won't be some big, dramatic announcement. It'll be more subtle. You can expect to see the finance ministries start to accelerate spending on projects, maybe even if it means breaking deficit targets. At the same time, the central bank will likely find quiet ways to inject more cash into the banking system. And the goal of all this? It's simple. Get credit flowing again and reignite that crucial SME engine.
But let's be clear, there are no easy, painless options here. It's a grim choice. On one hand, you have the slow, grinding stagnation that comes with continued austerity. On the other, you have the risk and volatility that comes with the growth-first stimulus.
So, the final takeaway is this. The political pressure for a change of course is just too immense to ignore. The era of tight credit and austerity is likely coming to an end. It seems the bet is that growth is worth the risk. It's a high-wire act, and it's about to begin.